This is Jeff Johnson, your host today for Insight Podcast. We're This is a simulcast of Abnormal Psychology 368 and Insight the Podcast, which brings to light the severe depression of Abraham Lincoln, his ability to overcome it, and doing so saved the Union with its very debilitating illness. But now is the reason he navigated the Union to victory over slavery and oppression. The clinical study in the resilience slide, title slide inside the podcast, the eternal battle, the brain as a battlefield, the internal landscape, the dysfunction, the parchment slide showing he couldn't attend duties, danger, the suicide slide, the removal of lethal means, DSM-5 checklist, the clipboard showing he met 6 out of 9 criteria, differential diagnosis, the scale comparing MDD versus normal grief, intervention, Joshua Speed and the power of social support, patient care plan, the clinical summary management strategy, and conclusion, the Sunset Memorial representing wisdom and rectitude. As we examine the clinical landscape of Abraham Lincoln, we must look past the statues and see the eternal battlefield. To understand the diagnosis of major depressive disorder, we have to recognize that while a war was dividing the Union, an equally devastating war was dividing his own mind. And this is a quote, I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there will not be one cheerful face on the earth. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forbade I shall not. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better, it appears to me. And if we look at this image, it combines the look of historical parchment representing Lincoln's letter and quotes about his misery with a clinical brain diagram designed to bridge the gap between the personal writings and the biological symptoms of depression we were discussing today. The visual is the normal and battlefield represented by the distress and the deviance of the mental state. To meet the DSM-5 criteria for diagnosis, there must be a dysfunction. For this wasn't just feeling blue. We had and this is another eyewitness account or eyewitness words. Lincoln, this wasn't just feeling blue. We have the historical testimony of his law partner William Herndon, who witnessed Lincoln's total incapacity to attend his duties. During the winter of 1841, Lincoln's dysfunction was so severe he couldn't leave his bed or attend a legislative sessions. He wrote to his partner, John Stuart, saying, I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would be not be one cheerful face on the earth. This paper trail of misery proves that his depression physically and professionally sidelined him, meeting the core requirements of clinical dysfunction. Lincoln went as crazy as a man could go. We had to remove razors from his room, take away all his knives and other such dangerous things. It was terrible. He said to me, Speed, I am done. I shall never be better. We watched him day and night for fear he would do harm to himself. And then now we move to the technical heart of the case study, the DSM-5 criteria for major depressive disorder. For a Formal diagnosis. A patient must meet at least 5 of the 9 criteria over a 2-week period. In Lincoln's case, we have evidence of at least 6. Depressed mood, confirmed by his own miserable band letters. Anhedonia. His friends noted the loss of interest in almost all social activities during his dark spells. Fatigue, reported as physical heaviness that made it hard for him to walk. Psychomotor retardation. His law partner described his movement as slow and heavy. Feelings of worthlessness. He frequently spoke of having done nothing to make the world remember him. Suicidal ideation. The removal of his razors by friends confirms the severity of this risk. By checking those boxes, we move Lincoln's story from a sadness to a documented clinical condition. Welcome to the special clinical edition of Inside the Podcast. Today, we are looking at an internal landscape of one of history's most resilient leaders. In abnormal psychology, we don't just look at the behavior, we look at the internal environment. For Abraham Lincoln, his mind was a battlefield. While the Civil War was tearing the nation apart, externally, a war of melancholy, what we now call major depressive disorder, was raging within him. This slide illustrates that his condition wasn't a choice. It was a stormy, persistent atmosphere that he had to navigate every single day of his presidency. He lived with a sustainable soul only by acknowledging the gravity of the internal war. His melancholy dripped from him as he walked. His step was slow and heavy, and as if his feet were made of lead, he would sit for hours with his head in his hands, staring at the floor. Obvious to the world around him, his sadness was part of his very being. And then we look at the mental health was a queer taboo back in the 1800s to talk about, mental illness. It was just not something you talked about. Lincoln was alone with his mental health diagnosis, what he gained in his life that he reconciled to depression. Lincoln was using his severe depression to aid him in the Civil War. There was an article that came out in the magazine that talked about how Lincoln could go very deep in his ability to resist his depression, to think through and feel the gravity of this paradox that he was in. Finally, we must perform a differential diagnosis. Was this just grief from losing his sons, or was it bipolar disorder? The evidence says no. Grief comes in waves. Lincoln's despair was a stagnant pool, and since there is no record of him ever experiencing a manic high, we rule out bipolar. This was unipolar, depression pure and persistent. In our clinical review, we must answer the question, was Lincoln just grieving the loss of his mother and sons? We call this a differential diagnosis. While grief comes in waves, Lincoln's symptoms were chronic and static because the despair led to a total loss of self-worth and persistent suicidal thoughts. The scale tips away from the normal bereavement and firmly into the major depressive disorder. This distinction is vital for a correct social work intervention. A diagnosis without an intervention is just a label. For Abraham Lincoln, the intervention was twofold: social support and meaningful work. First, his suicide watch with primitive but effective form of crisis intervention. His friends like Joshua Speed didn't just sympathize, they physically stayed with him. Removing the means of self harm, they provided the protective factors we look for today in social work. I said to And this is Lincoln. I said to him, Lincoln, or Joshua, you will be better. He looked at me and said, I have done nothing to make any human being remember that I have lived. I desire to live until I can connect my name with the events of my day and generation, and so to work as to satisfy my own heart that I have not lived in vain. In modern social work, we develop a care plan to manage chronic conditions. Lincoln's care plan had three main pillars: crisis intervention during his high risk danger phases. His community provided immediate stabilization by removing lethal means and providing 24-hour supervision. The protective social factor, his relationships were not just friendships, they were lifelines. By following others to share his internal battle, he reduced the isolation that fuels depression. Cognitive reframing through duty. Lincoln shifted his focus from his internal distress to an external mission, the preservation of the Union. This rectitude gave him a reason to remain sustainable. He didn't wait to feel better or to act. He acted in spite of how he felt. Lincoln proves that a clinical diagnosis is not a disqualification from greatness. He managed his darkness to light the way for the nation. Thank you for joining me for this session of Insight. I invite you to visit our Facebook page to share your thoughts on this profile. How does Lincoln's resilience inspire your view of mental health today? I'm Jeffrey L. Johnson. Stay sustainable and grace and peace to you. In this case study, we find that Abraham Lincoln's melancholy was not a sign of weakness, but the forge in which his leadership was tempered. From a social work perspective, Lincoln represents the ultimate intersection of clinical vulnerability and environmental strength. While he met the rigid criteria for major depressive disorder, suffering through dysfunction, danger, chronic despair, he survived through the unique synergy of protective factors by relying on his community for crisis intervention and anchoring his identity in rectitude, a moral duty to the Union. He transformed a debilitating condition to a sustainable life. His story reminds us that the mental health is not an absence of a struggle, but the presence of tools and purpose required to navigate. Today, we're asking a difficult question. Can a man who cannot leave his bed due to depression still save a nation? Let's look at the clinical reality of Abraham Lincoln. And this is the Inside the Podcast. This is what we usually do on the closing, and this is a historical perspective. Abraham Lincoln once wrote, I am the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on the earth. He was a man who lived in the valley of the shadow, a man whose friends had to remove knives and razors from his room for fear he would succumb to his own darkness. Yet Lincoln did not let the shifting sands of his emotions dictate the structure of his life. He found a rock in his purpose, the preservation of the Union and the liberation of the oppressed, and in growing desperate faith that drove him to his knees when he had nowhere else to go. And this is a benediction. May God, who sustained Lincoln in the dark halls of the White House, sustain you in your quietest hours of despair. May you find that even when your feelings are like sand, his promises are like flint. We pray that you receive the pure and the holier strength that Lincoln discovered, a strength that doesn't just survive the storm, but it is forged within it. Go forth with the malice towards none. with charity for all and with all foundation, that the gates of hell cannot prevail against it. Amen. If you're walking through a season of melancholy or severe depression today, do not build alone. Lincoln relied on his friends like Joshua Speed to keep his watch over him. Your call to action this week is to reach out. Don't just weather the storm in silence. Find your community of builders. Whether it's a professional pastor or a trusted friend, let someone help you secure your foundation before the next wave hits. And this is the Facebook question. We're continuing to deep dive and Inside the Podcast Facebook page. Lincoln used humor his vents to survive his gloom. We want to hear from you. Lincoln said his purpose gave him a reason to live when he felt he wanted to die. When your house feels like it's shaking, what is the one rock or core purpose that keeps you from falling? Join the conversation online. Your insight might be lighthouse for someone else that is looking for. Historical note for sermon for your podcast. Lincoln awfully quoted the doctrine of necessity, but as the Civil War progressed, this evolved it into a deep reliance on divine providence. The illustration used the image Lincoln's haunted eyes from late war photographs as a visual of a man whose house was beaten by wind and rain, yet stood firm because his foundation was a rebirth of freedom. And you can get that Facebook page at http semicolon / inside the podcast rectitudes. All right, that's our presentation for tonight. God bless you.